Good evening, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Lauren. I'm a first year studying government at the college, and I'm a member of the JFK Jr. Forum Committee. Before we begin, please note the exit doors, which are located on both the Park side and the JFK Street side of the forum. In the event of an emergency, walk to the exit closest to you and congregate in the JFK Park. Please also take a moment now to silence your cell phones and join me in welcoming Tenzin Gundmaro.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum at the Institute of Politics. My name is Tenzin Gundmaro, and I'm a sophomore at the college, as well as Director of Outreach for the Forum Committee. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing from Ambassador Susan E. Rice, a visiting fellow this week here at the IOP. Ambassador Rice most recently served as Domestic Policy Advisor to President Joe Biden from January 2021 to May 2023. Previously, Rice was President Obama's National Security Advisor and U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. She is the only person to have served in the White House as both National Security Advisor and Domestic Policy Advisor. During the Clinton administration, she was U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, as well as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director for African Affairs and Director for International Organizations and Peacekeeping at the National Security Council. Rice began her career as a management consultant and worked for several years at the Brookings Institution as a senior fellow. In 2019, she authored the New York Times bestselling memoir, Tough Love, My Story of the Things Worth Fighting For. Joining Ambassador Rice to moderate tonight's forum is Governor Deval Patrick. Governor Patrick is a professor of practice and co-director of the Center for Public Leadership at the Harvard Kennedy School. From 2006 to 2015, he served as the governor of Massachusetts, the first Black person to serve in this role. Before running for governor, Patrick was a staff attorney at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, assistant attorney general for civil rights in the Clinton administration, a partner at 2 Boston law firms, and a senior executive at 2 Fortune 50 companies. Patrick is a Rockefeller Fellow, a Crown Fellow of the Aspen Institute, and the author of 2 books, A Reason to Believe, Lessons from an Improbable Life, and Faith in the Dream, a call to the nation to reclaim American values. Before we begin, I also want to extend a thank you to our co-sponsor, the Center for Public Leadership. Now please join me in welcoming Ambassador Rice and Governor Patrick to the stage.
How cool is this? I just want to point out, Ambassador, that your book is bigger in one book than both of my books. And beautifully done. Welcome.
Thank you so much.
Delighted you're here.
Thank
welcome.
you for doing this,
It's
Governor.
a pleasure. It's a pleasure and an honor. And welcome everybody to tonight's forum. I have a couple of questions that kind of kick off our conversation, and then we will bring folks eventually to the mics. There are 2 on the lower level and 2 up above, and just kind of do a round robin. So please think of your questions, develop your questions, and we will come to you in a minute. So you have served at the senior-most levels of both foreign and domestic policy. You have had the ear of and the attention of some of the most powerful people in the world in making policy. So that path to power is extraordinary. How did you make those choices? How did you think about those choices?
Well, the truth is, it wasn't as if I was making choices every step of the way. I've had the opportunity this week to spend some really great time with the students here, particularly a lot of undergraduates, but also some graduate students, and I've been asked many times, how did you go from A to Z? And the truth is, there was no plan. I didn't know when I was in college, for instance, that I would end up in national security policy. I thought I was going to go to law school and be a public interest lawyer and an advocate for those who are low income and disadvantaged. And one thing led to another, and I ended up in a very different way. But what the foundation all of this really was my upbringing. And we maybe talk a bit about that, because my parents had an enormous influence on who I am and what I've become. And I was born and raised in Washington, D.C. I was born in 1964, so just to save you the math, I'm 58. I'm old. But I was born into a family and at a time where the issues of the day were really front and center. My mom and dad were both, in one way or another, involved in the business of Washington. My father was an economist and a banker. He worked at the World Bank, he worked at the Treasury Department. He was ultimately a governor of the Federal Reserve. But he came from the segregated South. He was born and raised in South Carolina during Jim Crow. He served during World War II with the Tuskegee Airmen. And you would think that was a big, glorious experience, but it was in many ways a deeply scarring experience, because he was fighting in a segregated, or serving in a segregated military, where the supposed mission was fighting for the freedom of everybody else but his own people. My mom was born and raised in Portland, Maine, and she was the daughter of immigrants from Jamaica who came to Portland, Maine in 1912 with no formal education. My grandfather was a janitor, my grandmother was a maid, and together they raised 5 children, my mother the youngest, and saved and scraped and sent all 5 of their children to college. And 3 of them went on to become doctors. One was a university president, and my mother was known as the mother of the Pell Grant. She was instrumental in getting that program established, among other things, that enabled 80 million Americans to go to college. And she went, by the way, to Radcliffe and was in the class of 1954, one of 3 black women in her class.
There were that many.
There were 3.
Yeah.
And that's a whole nother, we can talk about that. That was a whole nother story, which I write about in the book. But the point of all of this is to say that I was incredibly fortunate to have parents who were educated, they were professionals, they were successful. And as a young black girl in Washington, D.C., born in the mid-60s, I had a profound understanding of how rare that was, how privileged I was. And I had the opportunity to go to great schools in Washington, and everything was very fortunate for me, except, as I talk about in the book, my parents' very bitter divorce. But they raised me to have a sense of gratitude and understanding of how exceptional my circumstances were, and the obligation that placed on me to not live my life to be about myself, but to care about other people and to serve. So that was what guided me. That's the only thing I knew that has been consistent from start to finish, not the specifics of the path, was that I wanted to go and serve other people. I didn't know that would necessarily be in government. I certainly didn't know that it would begin and last for many years in national security. But the sense of doing something that was bigger than myself and for a larger community, whether that was local, national, or international, is what's guided me.
Outward facing, service, a servant leader. You write beautifully about your parents and your family in the book, and a couple of the lessons you talk about from your dad include lessons around self-esteem, which for a black girl, even in privilege, were enduring lessons for you. Can you just talk a little bit about how he got that message across to you, and got you to sort of practice believing in yourself?
Well, my dad took the mission of teaching his children, me and my younger brother, very seriously. He wanted us not to make the same mistakes that he'd made. And it drove him crazy if he saw us doing that. And so he would literally sit us down and give us what he called life lessons, and about all sorts of things. But among the most important to him, and I think also valuable to me and my brother, were how to think about race, how to think about being a person, in my case a woman, a black woman and a woman of color born into a world in which, that was not an easy thing to be. And if you don't mind, I want to just share a little bit about
just give
his
it back. That's
lesson. And I share this not to focus purely on race, but because as I said to some students I was speaking to earlier today, I think the big message that he was trying to deliver, and it applies to everybody, is don't let other people define you for you. You got to know who you are. And when people try to belittle you or criticize you or bully you or whatever it is, it's usually because they themselves have some sense of insecurity. And this is their way of coping. But so let me start here, and I'm just to give you a little bit of context. My dad's service to our nation has long been a source of pride for me, particularly his affiliation with the celebrated Tuskegee Red Tails, who defied every expectation of their skill and patriotism. But not for my father. He suffered no such romanticism. Until his death, Dad remained bitter about segregation in the military, profoundly objecting to the insult and irony of being made to fight for freedom for all but his own people. As offensive to him was the idea that blacks had to prove their worth to whites. As he explained, and I'm quoting him now, many black pilots thought that by serving in the Air Force, they were proving that they could fly just as well as white pilots. I, on the other hand, resented this notion, believing we had nothing to prove. In the same vein, Dad taught me, you don't have to prove anything to anyone but yourself. Never doubt that you are more than good enough. It was well after Tuskegee and his graduate education at Berkeley, as a professional in the 1960s, that Dad developed a strong philosophy on how to cope with pervasive discrimination. He grew certain that carrying around what he called the consciousness of being black continuously is a psychological burden. He noted you can't bring your best performance to bear as long as you have this additional drag on you. You have to free yourself of this in order to work to your full potential and to be able to compete fully. Somewhat counterintuitively, my father insisted, much like my mother, that we can't allow ourselves to be defined or bound by race. As hard as it might be and as unrealistic as it might seem, in my dad's view, it was better always to try to act, work, and perform as if there were no such thing as discrimination. My father distilled his hard-won experience, acquired over the years, into foundational life lessons, as he called them, which he methodically instilled in me and my brother. Dad summarized another key lesson on race as follows. I concluded that I'm only one person. I'm only human, and I cannot carry the burdens of the world around on my shoulder and at the same time function. So I was going to be myself, and I was not going to be constantly on my P's and Q's because people expected me to. If my being black caused a problem, it was not going to be for me, it was going to be for other people. As I replay these words in my head, I'm struck by how fully I've embraced my father's philosophy about race and gender as my own. My own refusal to allow what I look like to be my problem, one that gets in my head, is fundamental to the mindset that helped me succeed. Equally, I internalized Dad's message that I should never doubt my own abilities. This combination, being a confident Black woman who is not seeking permission or affirmation from others, I now suspect accounts for why I inadvertently intimidate some people, especially certain men, and perhaps also why I have long inspired motivated detractors who simply can't deal with me. So I realize that this is, this is about race, but I think it's valuable because we all have to know who we are and try to build those mental muscles of self-esteem. And it's as hard as it is to keep your body fit, to keep your mind and soul fit. But in some ways, I think it's the greatest gift my dad gave me, which is
the Tuskegee. Thank you for reading the passage. The Tuskegee Airmen were a famously tight group after they left service. They had that shared experience, and they supported each other as and when they could. Have you got a community of pals you turn to, of colleagues that you've worked with that are sources of solace and strength?
Yes,
Yes.
thankfully.
Okay.
And
We're going to get you to name them all here.
Well, first of all, family. My parents were extraordinary people, and they were my friends. It took me probably till age 25 or 30 to have a good friendship with my mom, because I was a difficult teenager. But she was one of my closest friends. My brother was my maid of honor in my wedding. When my parents divorced, we had each other as constants.
How old were you then?
I was 10 and he was 8. And we moved back and forth between our parents' homes, and as they went through a very bitter and ugly divorce and custody battle. But then I was blessed to have very great friends from growing up and in high school who are some of my closest friends to this day. I met my husband of 31 years in college, so my best friend came from college. And then, very fortunately, in the different stages of my work in government, I've made and kept friends who've been, extraordinary soulmates and partners and confidants and, running buddies.
Yeah.
So I feel very fortunate in that regard. But and without those friends and those and family, I don't think I could have done what I've done and managed through what I've managed.
Another of the lessons your dad taught and that you write about was how important it was not to take any crap from anybody.
Yeah, that's another one I internalized.
Yes. And I mean, it's a reputation you have. You're very forthright and unvarnished in some ways.
I can be polished when I have to.
I've seen that side. But you're a diplomat too.
I can do that.
Yeah. You can do that. But did you have to be self-conscious, self-aware of that directness as a diplomat?
Yes, but actually, I think there's a myth about diplomacy. Diplomacy doesn't mean being, fake and smiley and oblique and, diplomacy is, in my view, communicating, negotiating, executing with an understanding of those you're dealing with respect. And I actually found that a huge asset in diplomacy was being direct. So that if I was negotiating with the Russians or the Chinese, they knew what they saw with me is what they get. If I said, this is a no-go and there's no wiggle room here, they knew I meant it. If I said, you have my word that, we'll do X, Y, and Z, they knew I meant it. And that forthrightness with friends, allies, as well as competitors and adversaries, I've never found to be an impediment in diplomacy. You don't want to be rude. You don't want to be obnoxious most of the time. Once in a while, for theatrical purposes, it might help here and there. But for the most part, directness and diplomacy, in my experience, are not mutually exclusive in any way.
Well, yes, I can understand that, and I've seen that in you. I've also seen people get under your skin. And I remember a meeting we were at together with your other former counterparts, very senior people in state and in national security, from a bunch of administrations going way back. And it was shortly after President Trump was elected. And the conversation turned to the impact or potential impact of the new president and his behavior and his language on foreign policy. And one of the senior people there said, that's nothing. Watch what he does, not what he says. And the context was such that a lot of us were kind of back on our heels. I remember having to grab you by the back of your shirt and pull you back into your chair.
You're saying I was starting to take my earrings off?
You started to take the earrings off. Something's about to go down here. I mean, you have, we all have a range of emotions, including temper. You have a temper. When folks go deep, when they go, or they go way off channel. How did you manage that? Now, at that point, you were out of office.
I was out of office. I had been National Security Advisor, UN Ambassador.
Right.
And it was interesting, because we don't want to reveal who I was frustrated with. Somebody who I'm friendly with, who's, you would all know who this person is. But the context of the conversation was about Trump's insensitivity and his overt racism. This is the point at which he talked about shithole countries and, all the disparaging things he was.
Had Charlottesville happened? I think
yes.
It had. Yeah.
Or had just happened.
Right.
And the notion that, and this was, coming from another person of color, that we shouldn't be concerned that his language and his vitriol was consequential, struck me as so profoundly naive and dangerous. And it's, I'm sorry to say, been borne out by subsequent events. And so, there are times where I care deeply about things. I am not afraid to have a robust debate, discussion, argument. I try not to lose my temper where it's not constructive. But I didn't mind. But I care.
Yeah.
I care.
Yeah.
And what we ended up having in that room with a bunch of other people watching was a pretty robust debate around the issue. And we had to go off and continue it later and sort of unpack it together, because it was pretty powerful to have to acknowledge, frankly, in a room of our peers who came from a different background, that we had such a profound difference on something of that significance.
I want to come to your experience in domestic policy with President Biden, but on foreign policy just a little bit more. And thinking about some of the chaos in our government today. What, if any, impact does the language of a president, the behavior of our elected officials, or the careless, what feels careless and chaotic of some of our elected officials, does it have a bearing on the power and influence we project around the world, or is it just a show for us at home?
No, it has a profound bearing.
Talk about that.
I think traditionally, whether you agree with American foreign policy or profoundly disagree with it, I think, countries and people around the world have come to expect, particularly the President of the United States, but senior leaders in the United States, to act with some measure of responsibility and civility, even if the policies are profoundly wrong in their view. You rarely have you had leaders who blatantly and repeatedly lie. Rarely have you had leaders who, launch ad hominem attacks on anybody, other leaders, other countries, fellow Americans. And it's destabilizing, it undermines confidence in the United States. It gets in the way of forging alliances and partnerships and keeping them healthy. And we've seen, that just as to the point of that debate we were just talking about some years ago, words are not without consequence. They come from someplace and they foreshadow intentions and actions. And we've seen when language incites people to violence can occur. And so the notion that that somebody might be playing to a theater or to a base here in the U.S. and that doesn't matter to what it transpires overseas is completely a misplaced perspective, and I actually think disingenuous, which is why I might have gotten so frustrated.
Meaning that sort of thing is not understood to be innocent, in fact.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. You took the job of head of the Domestic Policy Council in the Biden administration, and I want to ask you, what about that role? Because that was your first domestic focus.
Yeah.
What about that role was different than making policy on the foreign policy side, and was surprising, knowing the vice president the then vice president, the president as you did when he was vice president?
Well, for me, there was a lot that was new and energizing. The whole set of issues, from healthcare policy to education, to rural development, to criminal justice and guns and immigration. All of these were issues that I had, for the most part, not spent years and years working on. So the learning was great, and the energy I got from that was great. So that was new. The other thing that was new is actually the nature of our laws. On the national security side, because of the constitutional authority of the president as commander-in-chief, there is a great deal more ability for the president to be directive to the agencies as to what they should do. And so as National Security Advisor, as I'm chairing the cabinet level meetings of the national security principles on, you name it, China, Iran, Ebola, what have you, it is appropriate and not exceeding any boundaries to be, to say, State Department, you should do X, Y, and Z, and blah, blah, and the president, president's authority is clear cut. On the domestic side, because of the Administrative Procedure Act, which I'd never heard of until I became Domestic Policy Advisor, not literally so, but almost, the agencies have inherent authority for rulemaking, for policy making. And so the president's authority to direct is much less clear cut and tenuous. And so you have to
Well, and
actually,
the agency's ability to respond quickly is also affected by the APA, no?
yes, when it comes to the rulemaking process. And so that was a big difference. But the similarity was the skills and the experiences of running an interagency policy process, which I first learned at age 28 when I was a junior staffer on the NSC, and which I got to see at every different level as I rose in the national security space, culminating in chairing these national security cabinet level meetings. That all translated into running domestic policy processes. The tools that you need to formulate policy, bring agencies together to surface ideas and initiatives, to vet those ideas, to make them coalesce and cohere into policy recommendations, to get those recommendations approved and advanced and then ultimately implemented. That's all pretty much the same with the caveat I mentioned about, how the Administrative Procedure Act affects domestic policy versus foreign policy. And so, I guess what surprised me the most in the domestic policy role, and this was a function of the time we were in and the leadership we had, was how much, honestly, in the first 2 years of the Biden administration, we were able to get passed through Congress with such narrow majorities. Now, think about it in today's context. We had a 50-50 Senate with the vice president casting a deciding vote on nominations, on policy, when the filibuster wasn't implicated. And we had a 4-seat majority max in the House with Speaker Pelosi. And yet, we were able to do many important things on a bipartisan basis. I don't think people may remember, we got the bipartisan infrastructure law passed. We got the PACT Act passed, which is for our veterans. We got the Bipartisan Safer Communities Act, which was the first significant gun safety legislation in 30 years on a bipartisan basis. The CHIPS and Science Act to help us onshore and compete in semiconductors and so many other things. All those were major bipartisan pieces of legislation. And then, using the reconciliation vehicle, we were able to get the American Rescue Plan through, which was hugely important in terms of pandemic relief. The Inflation Reduction Act, which was a very, very unprecedented climate investment and healthcare piece of legislation. And in all, frankly, within 2 years, before we had the turnover in Congress. And, that is, in my view, a testament, one, to the president's skill and experience as a legislator, and his patience and his sense of timing, which I'd frankly sometimes in the moment didn't understand. He had a very sophisticated view as to how we ought to sequence things.
Really? So he was involved at that level of detail?
Totally. And there are obviously some important things we didn't get done. We didn't get all of Build Back Better and its elements, child care and so many other important pieces done.
Voting rights.
Voting rights. Oh, and I should have mentioned the Marriage Equality Act, another bipartisan piece of legislation, and the Electoral Count Act. So all of this in the first 2 years with these very narrow majorities, and many of them being bipartisan.
Did you know the agenda was going to be that ambitious?
It was even more ambitious than what we got done.
I understand.
We just think
I understand.
Some things left. Yeah, but I didn't know that we would actually be able to get as much done. That's what I mean. That we knew what we were trying to do, but we didn't know that what we would end up doing. And then the other thing that surprised me is how difficult it has been, and frankly how much we have failed to communicate those successes in ways that people understand.
Well, say more about that, because I hear that.
And I'm not blaming the communicators. I mean, this is a big problem. Like, this is something we can maybe talk about when we get into the discussion part, but informed people that you and I know are, paying a lot of attention, well-educated, we sit down to dinner parties with, don't know half of what I just said. And if they did, they don't know what it means. And so part of it is some of these pieces of legislation are things that will come to fruition in years to come. Bridges, dams, internet connectivity, that's not going to happen overnight. But even the things that have happened overnight, like nobody in this country on Medicare anymore, and now nobody in this country, period, should be paying more than $35 a month for their insulin. That's a now thing for millions and millions of diabetics who rely on insulin, many of whom are paying hundreds of dollars a month. And so that's an example of, do they know? And if they know, do they know why and how that happened? So, where in a world in which, people, first of all, don't have a common fact base, derive their information from very disparate sources, often including, word of mouth and peers and everything else. How do we communicate and be heard?
And the answer to that question was not on your agenda, but it's on.
Well, it's on all of our agendas.
Yeah. In a minute, I'm going to call folks to come to the mics if you have questions. But before we do, I want to ask you from your perspective across that sweep of exposure you have had and experience you've had. Is our democracy secure in America?
No.
Why not? What do you see?
There's so many different aspects to it. We have structural problems. We have problems of community and cohesion, and polarization. And we have, I'm sad to say, an anarchist element in one of our major political parties that doesn't want anything to happen. And then add to that, and that's what we've been seeing the fruit of this past week. It's a small element, but powerful enough to shut down the United States House of Representatives. And as a consequence, a lot of governing. Or at a time when we're now up against another risk of shutdown in less than 45 days. But we also have elements of a major political party that, by their own words, are prepared to contemplate the use of force to get their way, are prepared to jettison the Constitution. Former president said that explicitly. So we're not even all in agreement, however much we might disagree with one another on policy or substance, that we are bound by the rule of law and bound by the Constitution. And in that context, we're in a precarious place. I don't think we're doomed. I'm not saying it's irreparable, but it's precarious. And we've got to address it. And some of the structural problems, just to give you some examples. You all know about the lack of social cohesion and how we all live in, basically you can predict one's political philosophy based on what zip code they live in. And the fact that, if people on one side of Boston don't know what the lives are like or the experience of people over here in Cambridge. And in DC, same thing. And not to mention, people in, in Boston not understanding what somebody in rural New Hampshire might think or feel. But structurally, because of partisan gerrymandering, because of our system now being one in which most elections are primaries, the most consequential elections are primaries. There are very few seats in the House of Representatives, for example, that are actually competitive between the parties at any one time. We are rewarding the extremes. The extremes have outsized power in both parties, and the center is evaporating. And that's, sorry, you all right?
It's not you.
I know, but if you go down, I'm going with you, so.
That's fluidity right there. I'm going to let you finish the sentence, and then I want to go to the question.
So anyway, I think there are many, many challenges that we have in our democracy, and I think there are few more urgent issues than all of us realizing what's at stake and in choosing to preserve it, which we have the capacity to do. This is a problem of our own making, unlike many others. Many problems are our own making, but this is one uniquely of our own making as Americans, and one that I think, therefore, we have the capacity to resolve if we have the will to do so.
Thank you. Let's start here.
Where's he? Oh, man, not this guy. Come on, man.
Please, you guys know each other.
Hi, Dwight.
Please just say your name and
Ambassador.
affiliation. And remember, for everybody, a question ends in a question mark. Not just raising your voice at the end of a statement, but an actual question mark. Okay, please.
Yes, Governor, thank you. And thank you, Ambassador. We come to the forum and we hear about the polarization, we hear about the dysfunction, we hear about the hopes and prayers to fix it. You've uniquely served in many administrations across many portfolios. What would be your magic wand to fix it? And when are you going to pull it out in the next administration?
Well, funny you should ask. The concluding chapter of this book is about our domestic political polarization and some of my thoughts on what we can and should do. There is no magic bullet, and things have gotten worse since 2019 when I published this. But apart from electing people who believe in our Constitution and the rule of law, I think there are some things we could do that get at some of the structural issues that we certainly should do. I don't think they're sufficient in themselves, but they would be powerful. I mean, we don't teach our children civics education. We don't teach folks how to debate and discuss with people with whom they disagree and do so civilly. We need to, in my opinion, change our primary process and move to tools like ranked choice voting so that the center is rewarded and not the extremes. If I had a magic wand, and I don't, I would, and this is, people are going to find this perhaps controversial, although I'm not sure why they should. I would have mandatory national service for everybody in this country aged 18 to 21.
I agree with that.
And I don't care how rich you are, I don't care how privileged you are, I don't care how poor you are, I don't care whether you're here documented or undocumented. If everybody had to spend a year living and working with people from every different background in this country, working on common projects, whether it's reforestation or laying broadband cable, it doesn't matter what it is, painting schools. I believe profoundly that it's really hard to hate somebody when you know them.
Yep.
It's not impossible. There's always exceptions. But when you get to know people, you come to realize that even when you have profoundly different faiths or orientations or perspectives, that at the end of the day, as human beings, we pretty much all want the same thing for ourselves. We want to feel secure. We want to be able to love who we love. We want to be able to to hope that, the future is brighter than the past, and that, my kids will do better than I did. And these are universals. And we don't have that because we don't know each other. So I really believe that universal service, I'm not talking about military service, I'm talking about national service, which could include military service, but not limited to it, is a very, very powerful tool to bring us together and compel us to know one another and build some basic foundational faith and trust in one another.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's go up here. You can think about the question I'm going to ask you about your own political future, and if there is one. So just hold that for a second, please.
Thank you, Ambassador Rice. My name is Eunice Chan, and I'm a sophomore at the college. And I'd like to ask about your foreign policy work. So what measures, if any, have you taken to mitigate paternalism in sensitive areas such as global health crises and epidemics?
Did you say paternalism?
Paternalism. As a representative of the United States or at large the Western world, paternalism is definitely something that exists with their history of tropical medicine, global health, etc.
I'm not sure that we ever, or I ever, framed our humanitarian response or development assistance through the frame of fighting paternalism. We viewed it through the prism of empowering women and empowering women in the context of education, of preventing and resolving conflict in our global health responses. And I think most of you know the demonstrated value of girls' education for the health and well-being of any given society. When you educate your girls, the growth and development potential is vastly increased. But it wasn't framed in terms of fighting paternalism as much as it was, I guess that you could argue maybe that they're two sides of the same coin. I'm not sure that's what you have in mind. But our view has long been that, whether it's our development work or our partnership with other countries or our domestic health and success, none of that is going to fulfill its potential in the absence of a very conscious and deliberate focus on supporting and empowering women.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, my name is Gabby. I'm a first-year PhD student in health policy here. And I was really interested in what you were talking about when Governor Patrick asked about sort of the differences between the Domestic Policy Council and your national security-related experiences. And you talked a lot about sort of the laws that govern what we can and can't do in those spaces, but I'm wondering if you could speak to some of the choices we make about investing in social policy-related things or not, versus sort of the resources that you had available in the national security space.
Mm-hmm.
Well, there are different times and different contexts,
Yeah.
But let me talk about most recently. President Biden spoke a lot during the campaign about what he called a foreign policy for the middle class, meaning that our international strength was to a large extent predicated on our strength at home. The viability of our economy, whether people had opportunity, whether we were investing in America, whether it's our healthcare system, access to healthcare, education, child care, job creation, all of those things, which is why he proposed such an expansive early piece is the wrong word, early body of legislation in Build Back Better. And I think we've moved away, at least in our current construct, from a sort of simplistic distinction between that which is investing in our leadership abroad and that which is investing in our strength at home. We see them as much more inextricably linked. The budget
in the
process.
current administration.
Yes, the budget process doesn't reflect that. And the structure in Congress and how committees appropriate funds don't reflect that. And that's a real challenge. And you often hear in the budget negotiations, how much you're going to spend on defense and how much you're going to spend on non-defense discretionary, and then blah blah blah. And we have tried, both in the Obama administration and in the Biden administration, to ensure that those rose in tandem and that they didn't get out of whack. And not with complete success. And that's been an area where we've had to make compromise and adjustments, including in the debt ceiling deal that just was enacted earlier this year. But I do think and I think our national security leaders would be the first to say this old bifurcation, this old notion that these are two separate things that are not mutually reinforcing, is a sort of way of thinking that has passed its prime.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Ambassador. Thank you for being here. My name is Sebastian. I'm a JD MBA. So you talked a little bit about challenges to our democracy and some of the problems and challenges that we have. And I want to bring up the case of Puerto Rico and the territories. I am originally from Puerto Rico. And thank you for all the work that you did in the last 2 years for Puerto Rico. But I want to ask you, how can Puerto Ricans, in my case, think about the structural issues and the chicken or egg problem? In my case, I'm a supporter of statehood, but I know that that's not the only solution. Do we fix our internal governance issues, which are severe, and money is not the only solution, or do we need to push for a federal solution to the status situation? It feels like this issue continues to divide Puerto Ricans on a day-to-day basis, and we just need to move on. And I would love your advice as to how we can do that.
Well, it would be it'd be arrogant of me to give advice on how to do it. And I think, as you pointed out, there really are significant divisions within Puerto Rico about statehood versus not statehood. And so it makes it even harder for somebody from outside to have a judgment on that. I come from the District of Columbia, and I was born and raised there, and I'm still a long-suffering, non-voting citizen of the district. I mean, we have no voting representation in Congress, and we have voted for statehood on numerous occasions, and it's still not going to happen. But I do think that, because that discussion and debate is not going to resolve itself internally anytime soon, much less then garner the necessary response from the rest of the country, that there is an urgency and a premium on, strengthening governance in the moment inside of Puerto Rico. And I did have some opportunity and experience while I was domestic policy advisor on, strengthening the federal partnership with the Puerto Rican government and trying to help marshal our resources more effectively to deal with some long-standing issues like, electrification, like, education, resilience, and it's challenging. It's hard enough to corral the federal government to get its act together, but I think we made some progress in that. But it's hard to ensure that we are plugging in and working in tandem as best we can. And I think we made real progress, but I do think, and as you said yourself, that there's some significant challenges in terms of governance and coordination that I think the people of Puerto Rico would benefit from seeing addressed.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sebastian. Over here.
Hi, thank you so much for coming to speak with us. My name's Trey. I'm a senior at the college. My question is also about foreign policy. So over the past 3 or 4 years, we've seen a lot of coups in Western and Central Africa. And with that comes a lot of questions about human rights and human rights violations, but they've also been portrayed largely as anti-colonial efforts, particularly against like the French government. So I'm kind of wondering what your take on that dilemma is, and specifically what stance the United States and then generally the West should take towards these new regimes that are kind of painting themselves as liberatory but might have human rights violations underneath them.
Well, I would start by, looking at what Africa itself has said about coups and unconstitutional overthrows of regimes. The African Union has taken a very strong stand in essentially saying if you come to power by coup, you're suspended from membership of the African Union. In the West African region, and I know it's not without controversy and challenge, ECOWAS has taken a similarly strong stand, at least the members of ECOWAS that haven't recently been governments overthrown in coups. And I think, from the United States point of view, we obviously have long stood, for in opposition to coups. Our laws are structured so that, when the U.S. determines that a coup has taken place, our aid is immediately suspended. And then you have to look at sort of what's underneath these. One of the themes that we're seeing play out in at least several of these instances is the influence of the Wagner Group and Russia's proxy mercenary forces on the ground, which are in many of these countries. Mm-hmm. The regimes are beholden to them. It's a new form of colonialism where dictators or elected leaders, even in some cases, are paying out huge sums of natural resources to a rapacious foreign mercenary army to guarantee their security. So, I mean, what's happening inside a number of these countries has deep roots, and many of these things are not black and white. But I think from the perspective of U.S. policy, we've got to be very careful not to validate or in any way gloss over these extra constitutional changes in power, which are, I'm confident, going to fuel in time another counter-reaction. We're going to have backlash after backlash after backlash, and it's going to just deepen instability.
Thank you.
We are supposed to wrap at 8.
It's 8:01.
Maybe take one question, and then you can answer mine, and we'll wrap. Go ahead.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for being here. My name is Jason with MCMPA program. I'm from Taiwan. My question is regarding with U.S. and China relations. You've served in various administrations with the capacity of foreign policy and national security. And the U.S. relations with China have also shifted from the strategic cooperation to strategic competition. And the trend seems to be projecting to be a downward spiral between U.S. and China. How do you see as the solution from the relationship on both sides from being worsening or deteriorating? Because a worsening U.S. and China relations would impact the world on a very large scale. Thank you.
Well, I would say first of all,
This is called the lightning round, by the way.
That's a hard one to do in a lightning round. The challenge for the United States and China is to ensure that our competition, which is intense, does not inadvertently spiral into conflict. And that to the extent we can, and it's becoming harder and harder, and I'm not going to go into chapter and verse of reasons for this, that we maintain, or I would argue even reestablish, the ability to cooperate where it's in our mutual interest. And an example that during the Obama administration that we were able to collaborate on was climate. And that was how we got the Paris Climate Agreement. I mean, there were other aspects to it, but that was a critical component. And there's nothing about the climate challenge that makes U.S.-China cooperation any less urgent or important today than back then. But the nature of the competition, economic, security, strategic, is intensifying. You know, we've got to compete. We've got to be prepared. We've got to ensure that economically and militarily and otherwise that we are ready and taking care of business and shoring up our alliances and partnerships. But we've got to be careful, as I think this administration is and the president is, not to slip into a situation that could spiral out of control. I'm concerned, to be honest, that I'm not seeing the same degree of, or at least not consistently the same degree of resolve on the Chinese side. You know, things like having open channels, open military channels, you know, the equivalent of hotlines. These are things that are really important if we're going to avoid an inadvertent or even potentially deliberate provocation leading to something more serious. And we have repeatedly argued the importance of reestablishing those kinds of mechanisms and channels, and I hope that that'll be reciprocated by the Chinese side.
Are you thinking about politics in the future for yourself? Do you think about...
I don't know, Duval. What am I supposed to do? I'm from the District of Columbia.
You got Maine roots.
I do, but they're roots. They're not. It's not my hometown. It's not where I am given my, you know, my long life.
But what is it, a person with a service orientation as deep as yours is not done?
Why not? What do you think I should do? That's why I'm here. I'm trying to like find myself and, you know.
Well, we could take a survey in this room, but I see our time is up. Ambassador Susan Rice, thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate you.